Hello again. This is my second lecture on Weimar Germany. This time I will focus on stabilization and economic depression between 1923 and 1932. In my first lecture, I have introduced the early Weimar years as a period that was dominated by uprisings and right-wing crackdowns, by inflation, hyperinflation, and the confrontation with the Allies, which led to the Ruhr occupation. Germany was on the brink of a breakdown in 1923. In this lecture, I will deal with stabilization and economic depression in the years between 1923 and 1932. My questions are, why was there no breakdown in 1923? How did the Republic manage to recover and stabilize after 1924? But then, was there really a true chance to stabilize the Republic? Or was all this rather deceptive? Were there downsides to the stabilization? Finally, how did the onslaught of economic depression from late 1929 change politics? My key points are, first, a rational approach to government prevailed. It was relatively successful in foreign policy, which showed some promise in domestic politics and benefited in turn from economic stability. But second, there were still divided camps within German society, and consequently there was an unwillingness to take responsibility in government. And third, in the economic depression, democracy became ever more unpopular, and the president and chancellor, the prime minister, showed little interest in preserving it. My starting point is the person of Gustav Stresemann, probably the most important statesman in the Weimar Republic. Stresemann was initially an industrial lobbyist who had sympathies for radical nationalism during the First World War. He was one of those who wanted to expand Germany in both Western and Eastern Europe, one of those who were not very interested in a compromise peace with the Allies. After 1918, he became a politician of the German People's Party, a right-liberal party that was initially hostile to the Republic. In 1923, he briefly became chancellor between August and November. As such, he was determined to get out of the quagmire by facing the situation as it was, dealing reasonably with hyperinflation, with the confrontation with the Allies, and accepting that Weimar was a republic and that the monarchy was definitely over. What he did was to end the passive resistance in the Ruhr area, in a way acknowledging that this form of resistance was ultimately doomed to fail. His government also stabilized the German currency by tying it to the dollar. At the beginning, there were 4.2 trillions of old marks for $1, but once this relationship had been stabilized, one could cut the 4.2 trillions to a sort of much smaller amount of new mark. This gave the currency a stable basis, a restored trust, both domestically and internationally, thus creating the conditions for credit and investment to fuel the economy. Without trust in the currency, no one lends anyone any money, no one invests. These are necessary preconditions to get an economy on its feet again. Also, Stresemann began to negotiate with the Allies. It's important to remember that he was to remain foreign minister until 1929. He benefited from a change in government in France to a more conciliatory government, less hardline government. In turn, the French withdrew from the Ruhr area. They were helped by British pressure and the prospect of American re-involvement in Europe. And this was necessary for the French because the French had to cope with their own inflation, albeit not as extreme as in Germany, and they had war debts with the Americans. Though they needed some American re-involvement in order to be able to repay their loans that America had given them. The so-called Dawes Plan in 1924 was named after an American banker, Dawes. This plan depoliticized the reparation issue by placing the crucial assessment of German finances. How much did German finances amount to in the first place? Only then could the amount of reparations be fixed. And this decision was placed into the hands of a committee and thus into the hands of managers as opposed to politicians. The plan also gave Germany a break by establishing manageable payments for the next years and by allowing international loans. Thus, a circle was established between American loans, German reparation payments, and French repayments of American loans taken during the war. This worked for a while, got the economy moving again, before, alas, proving highly sensitive to the stock market crash in 1929, when the Americans were withdrawing their loans, and the whole thing crashed. The Locarno Treaty, concluded in October 1925, was a treaty in which Germany agreed to accept the borders in the west, Alsace-Lorraine, Eupen-Malmedy, small territory that had been lost to Belgium. And these borders were guaranteed by Britain and Italy. Through these negotiations, Germany again established itself as a partner in the diplomatic concert. It displayed a rational approach to different interests. It also benefited from the symbolic side of joining the League of Nations, of a whole movement in favor of Franco-German reconciliation and youth exchange and cultural exchange, in the cooperation between business people. After all, Germany and France were two close societies, neighboring each other with an interest in cooperating. The approach in the East was, however, different. Germany refused to accept borders with Poland and kept the option for future revision open. For instance, in the event of a Polish-Russian war, Germany might find an opportunity to intervene and correct the borders again. Now, was Stresemann just a German nationalist, someone who faked reconciliation to calm the weathers in the West and have a free hand to take on Poland in the East at the next opportunity? Or did this reflect a genuinely new approach of a diplomacy that was based on international economic cooperation, though necessarily compromising with the right? I would rather tend towards the latter interpretation. Because Stresemann was willing to opt for compromises and willing to rationally use Germany's economic potential. And this did mean a clear change. Stresemann acknowledged that Germany was part of a global economy and thus had an interest in cooperating. Whether or not international cooperation would ultimately have led to accepting the border with Poland is hard to tell, given that Stresemann died in 1929. What is significant, however, is that there was much dissatisfaction in Germany with this whole gradual, reasonable approach to foreign policy. In order to fully understand the situation, we need to look at domestic politics. Domestic politics between roughly 1923 and 1928 was based on various cabinets of the political center, between democratic Catholics, right liberals, liberal Democrats, even conservatives who had previously been staunchly opposed to the Republic. All this reflected that there was no clear pro-Republican majority anymore since 1920. In this lie a chance to stabilize the Republic by drawing former opponents into a grudging acceptance and then into working within the constitutional framework of the Republic. It was also a chance of establishing an interplay between government and opposition, between center-right and center-left. Given that right-wing interest groups too, agricultural interest groups, industrial interest groups, needed access to a government. In a similar vein, the old General Hindenburg was elected president in 1925. And, at least initially, he respected the constitution and played by the rules. Now, what about the electoral basis for stabilization? If we very roughly compare elections between December 1924, May 1928, and September 1930, we find that Democratic Catholics were stable at around 12%. Social Democrats, too, were stable, averaging about 26–27%. Both parties could rely on a rather solid network of associations in which people discussed issues, played football, or vacationed with fellow Catholics or Social Democrats. We find the Communists slowly rising from 9 to 13%, which was due to to one of the downsides of stabilization, that it brought about quite high unemployment. And the communists, far from meeting their objective of becoming the foremost working class party, became increasingly a party of the unemployed.